Vojtěch Volák. My main topic of research is semiotics of music and generally philosophy of music. I think that philosophy of music is a really neglected area of philosophy. In the same way that the metal music is neglected area of philosophy of music. So I believe there's a lot of to be observed and told here. My today topic is about heaviness, and I see it as a key concept of metal music, and I'll try to bring forward a description or conceptual idea how to make understanding about heaviness. I'll try to do it through Deleuzian philosophy and his terms. So, one of the main elements attributed to metal music is the quality of heaviness. Very few academics devoted themselves to research of this quality of music, even though it is very often used to describe metal music. My goal today will be to construct a possible way of understanding this quality as a vehicle of meaning. I will use the concepts of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze for this because I believe that through his metaphysical concepts we can more easily understand the ever-changing and highly contextual field of musical meaning. First, I'll present the current academic research which dealt with heaviness, and then I will present individual definitions that were presented by various authors. Then I will outline a part of Deleuze's philosophy, more precisely his notion of intensity as a genetic source of qualities and extensities. And through this conceptual position, I'll try to create a possible interpretation of the notion of heaviness. So, heaviness as a term for sound quality appears in many literatures on metal music and is the subject of theorizing. For example, it's used for description of metal music by Filipov, Wiederhorn or Weinstein, and they use it to describe the sound qualities of metal music and its subgenres. However, these authors never explain the term, they only rely on the connotation properties of the word heaviness. Another group of thinkers and scientists go even further and conceptualizes the heaviness as the quality of electric distorted guitars, for example Berger and Fales. Where some observe these qualities, mostly distortions, for example Herbst and tuning, Kahn, Harris, Minute and Washburn. They conceptualize this heaviness throughout the history of metal music, and some argue that metal music becomes heavier and heavier over time. So my question is, what makes it heavier? For some, it is already mentioned in the timbre of electric guitars, from which lower frequencies are directly expected, as Minute in his 2013 work said. Some believe that the ways of distorting the instruments create greater feeling of heaviness over time. We will move to two important Berger's observations. First is, heaviness is a comparative term, and in any act of listening, the quality of the metal fan's heaviness experience is shaped by his past experience with the distorted sounds of the electric guitar. And the other one is, any element of musical sound can be heavy if it evokes a sense of power or any gloomy emotion, and the history of metal music can commonly be seen as a pursuit of heavier and heavier. We can see that the Berger's observation here show us two important aspects of heaviness. I like to call it the double fault of the physical objectivity of certain sound qualities and the mental experience-based subjectivity of the individual. Heaviness is therefore a concept we use to describe a notion of specific comparative change in our musical experience. We compare our previous musical experience with the current listening experience, and we sense the difference between those two individual events. For Berger, it would be the difference in the level of distortion of electric guitars in each individual listening event. I partly disagree with this because, in my opinion, heaviness is definitely a comparative term, and I believe that's the key element of the citation I provided here. But I think it's not exclusively exclusive to quality. It's not reserved exclusively for quality of timbre of distorted electric guitars. Because I believe that we can find heaviness in other genres that are guitarless. The second physical fault is the main topic I'll be dealing today. The second fault concerns the power Berger mentions, the power that heaviness symbolizes or evokes. And I ask, what is this power or force? And here I propose a Deleuzian notion of intensity as a way of conceptualizing that, what Berger calls power. Intensity is perceived as a pure difference in itself, which is itself incomprehensible to our senses. It is a certain force which we perceive through its influence, its effect on the world. It thus exceeds the possibility of empirical grasp, yet it is accessible to us through the extensities it precedes, which it gives the possibility of origin. So it is a kind of virtual clash, a pure difference that is actualized through the extensities it creates. The intensity is real, but it does not exist anywhere but in its extensities or qualities. However, the extensity is not identical nor at all similar to intensities from which it originates. It is only one instance of it. We have a double possibility of difference here, extensive and intensive. When we divide the extensive differences, for example, length, content or volume, in two parts, we cut a piece of wood in half, we pour half of glass of milk into another glass, we end up with two halves of the same extensities. On the other hand, intense differences, temperature, pressure and sound, must undergo a material change in this division, because we cannot divide or add a few units of that given differences without creating that material change. Because the intensity of a certain encounter, a feeling that does not correspond to any empirical category, forces our mental faculties into a transcendent act, the creation of new identities or ideas. Deleuze's ontology of becoming denounces the error we commit when we think exclusively in terms of things and their qualities. Because by privileging extensities and extended magnitudes, we bypass the intensive genesis of the extended, which Deleuze called transcendental illusion. In an ontology of forces like Deleuze's, force refers to the relation between forces. Forces are experienced only through the results they render, and the results of force fields are extensive and qualitative. Thus, if we apply this understanding of intensities as some kind of virtual potentials which forces reach and through which they create what we perceive, that is, specific qualities and extensities of our spatial world, we can better understand how the feeling of heaviness arises in the music. Now we must turn to certain physical, I would call them semiotically objective properties of sounds. Due to the limitation of time, I will focus only on two specific features. First one is David Huron's acoustic ethological model, which posits that there are certain objective meanings to the physical properties of the sounds. His model considers two intensities, volume and pitch. If we hear some sound containing high pitch and high volume, we associate it with alarm, fear and energy. For example, if someone is in danger, he or she will scream in high volume, high pitch, and that's what we objectively and generally decipher as alarming or fearful sound. The other interesting one is the low pitch, high volume, because we, from our, I would say, ecological experiences in the world, we know that big objects, big bodies in the world create a low pitch, high volume sound. So whenever we hear this type of sound, we automatically decipher this meaning of sound as something big is coming our way. Here we can see that not only by changing the pitch, but also changing the intensity of the volume, there is a change in how we perceive the sound. As I said, if someone is dangerous. The second element of the sound I will be focusing now is the location of the sound. Here we use the Soundbox model introduced by Moore and Dockeray. The sound, I'm incredibly sorry, my phone is ringing. Sorry. The second element is the location of the sound. Here we use the Soundbox model introduced by Moore and Dockeray. The Soundbox model provides a way to conceptualize the texture space in which the recording or the sound production takes place by allowing us to hear the recording in the space. Despite the fact that Moore talks about the sandbox exclusively within the recording of the sound and music, this model can also be applied to the live listening because it also takes place in a certain space, and the space is also taken into account in a given performance. Moore speaks of the Soundbox model as a heuristic model of how the location of the sound source works in the recording process and acts as a virtual spatial closure for resource mapping. It further describes 4 aspects of the Soundbox. I'll be focusing mainly on the 3 main aspects because the 4th one is time, and I believe that the time component doesn't deal with space, but rather with duration in the space. And I believe the decision to place the time on the same level as the following 3 characteristics seems kind of misleading to me. As time in this case acts as what allows space to be perceived and can be found within the rest of the Soundbox characteristics. Moore himself focused mainly on the spatial characteristics of the Soundbox. So, first aspect is laterality. It is based on the human property of binaural perception of the sound. The fact that we have 2 auditory receptors, 2 ears, which we not necessarily conscious, but through that we are able to distinguish even minimal differences in the sound properties, such as a time difference between sound effects on the ear membrane, and we can determine the direction from which sounds comes from space. The second aspect is prominence, an aspect consisting of a relative dynamic level and degree of distortion. Prominence deals with our ability to distinguish 2 different sounds from sound landscape and to measure them against each other within the space to determine their approximate distance from us. This aspect is very important to the heaviness as such, as Mark Minute notes that the sounds contained in the heaviness will be perceived not only as containing great power and great size, but also as sounds very close and intimate to the listener. Our ability to discern the distance between individual sound sources and us listeners is the ability to discern a certain intensity of proximity through its extensities and qualities. In this case, it may be the volume that is a factor of both dynamic level and distortion level. The third last aspect of Soundbox is registry. It deals with pitch in a given space, but other than laterality or prominence. It concerns only the pitch of the tone, namely its contextual evaluation and of perception within the passage of time. If we hear a sequence of tones, we can determine when the sequence decreases and when it rises. Thus, we tend to perceive higher tones spatially high, just as low tones are perceived spatially low within the space. If we hear 2 different instruments playing the same note at the same pitch, such as, for example, flute and clarinet, we can determine which sounds seems higher in the space. This is due to the timbre. The sound of musical instruments contains not only the fundamental frequency, but also many other overtones. The sound of the whistle in this case contains a higher concentration or fluid higher concentration of higher harmonic and non-harmonic components, thanks to which we perceive it spatially higher compared to the sound of the clarinet, which does not have such large ratio of these components. If we analyze the properties of sound mentioned here, its qualities and ecstasities which we perceive, we can see that the heaviness is a feeling evoked in us through the action of these ecstasities, which we perceive, in these ecstasities is always the result of the action of intensities. The intensity of proximity that we perceive as a sound of distortion, the intensity of spatial size, the power of the body, which we perceive through the intensity of volume and pitch. I can throw another concepts here, for example, dissonance as an intensity of density, and many other, the speed of the song as some kind of intensity of smaller and smaller time fragments being presented to us. Or for example, if you look at some progressive metal music and to their usage of odd time signatures and different rhythm meters, we can see it as some kind of intensity of chaos, of, I would say, pure chaos, of not returning to the rhythmic original formula, but breaking it in every single piece and kind of playing with the listener in itself. So I would say that heaviness is thus an experiential comparative designation for a specific aspect of the musical experience, which suggests that the degree and amount of intensity that is placed in presence of the senses through given extensities and qualities. It consists objective part, the extensities and qualities sharing certain physical properties which indicate the degree of intensity that produce them. For example, the low frequency equals large amount of energy, etc. And the second, subjective part, listening experience and the degree of ability to distinguish individual sounds of listening as sounds of musical expression, which we then contextualize with that listening experience, with now listening experience, which allow us to determine the difference in intensity of the current composition with our previous experience. The subjective part deals with the I would say notion of that, I believe Dr. Spraken said it, that maybe Iron Maiden isn't metal to some listeners nowadays, because they are their experience with heaviness is completely different than it was for the listeners in the 80s and 90s that listened to Iron Maiden and thought, oh my god, this is so heavy, this is my first experience, or this is the experience of never ever before experienced level of intensities in my life. So this is for me the maximal heavy music. But for some people in nowadays that listen to, for example, deathcore or technical death metal, their perception of heaviness, their feeling of heaviness is somewhat different based on these subjective listening experiences. And I believe this is all for me. So I thank you for your time, and now it's time for questions.